Marcus had worked hard to buy his house. It wasn't just a place to live, it was a symbol of everything he had fought for. The long hours at the firm, the years of sacrificing weekends, the endless grind, it all been worth it. This house, this backyard, and most importantly, this pool were his to enjoy. But lately, something had been bothering him. Something that made his stomach twist every time he stepped outside. His neighbor Karen had started using his pool like it was hers. At first, it was little things. He'd come home from work and notice wet footprints on the deck, though he hadn't been in the water that day. Then he started hearing voices, her voice, floating over the fence, followed by splashes and laughter. He brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was imagining things, or maybe her kids had accidentally thrown a ball over and had to jump in to retrieve it. But then, one Saturday morning, he got undeniable proof. Marcus had woken up earlier than usual, planning to enjoy a peaceful morning with a cup of coffee by the pool. But as soon as he stepped onto the deck, he froze. There she was, Karen, floating on a giant pink flamingo, sunglasses on, a mimosa in one hand, looking as relaxed as if she were at a resort. For a moment, he just stared, trying to process what he was seeing. This woman, this same woman who barely acknowledged him in passing, the same one who once complained about his music being too loud for the neighborhood, was now lounging in his pool without a care in the world. She didn't even notice him at first. She was too busy scrolling through her phone, occasionally laughing at whatever she was looking at. Beside her, on the edge of the pool, was a half-empty bottle of champagne and a plate of what looked like croissants. Marcus glanced around and noticed something else: two empty glasses. She wasn't alone. His jaw clenched as he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He didn't want to explode, but the audacity of it all was making his blood boil. Finally, he cleared his throat loudly, making sure she heard him. Karen flinched and turned her head slowly. When she saw him standing there, arms crossed, expression unreadable, she had the nerve to smile. "Oh, hey, Marcus," she said, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "Didn't think you'd be up this early. Lovely morning, isn't it?" Marcus stared at her, struggling to find the right words. He wasn't sure if he was more shocked at the blatant trespassing or the complete lack of shame. "Karen," he said, his voice steady but firm, "what the hell are you doing in my pool?" She let out a light laugh, waving a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. It's just a little dip. You weren't using it." Marcus took a slow, deliberate step forward. "That's not the point." Karen sighed, as if he was the one being unreasonable. "Look, the sun was out, the water looked amazing, and honestly, I was doing you a favor. A pool this nice deserves to be appreciated." Marcus could feel his patience slipping. "You do realize this is trespassing, right?" Karen scoffed. "Oh, please. We're neighbors. It's not like I broke into your house." Marcus exhaled sharply through his nose. He could already tell this conversation was going to be an ordeal. But one thing was for sure, he wasn't letting this slide. Not this time. Marcus tightened his jaw as he stared at Karen, who was still lounging in his pool like she had every right to be there. The sheer audacity of her response left him momentarily speechless. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't apologetic. She acted as if this was her personal country club, as if his hard-earned backyard belonged to her. "Get out," he said finally, his voice calm but edged with steel. Karen sighed dramatically and took another sip of her mimosa. "Marcus, come on. You're being uptight. It's just a pool." His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "My pool." She rolled her eyes and lazily paddled toward the edge. "Fine," she huffed, lifting herself out of the water. The flamingo float wobbled as she stepped onto the deck, completely unbothered. She grabbed a towel, his towel, off one of the lounge chairs and patted herself dry. Marcus glared at her. "How long have you been doing this?" Karen shrugged, adjusting her sunglasses. "A few times a week, maybe? I mean, it's just sitting here, and let's be honest, you don't seem like the type who swims much." That was it. That was the moment Marcus decided he was done playing nice. He had let too many things slide before. The passive-aggressive comments about his music, the way she conveniently ignored him but was overly friendly with the other neighbors, the way she acted as if her presence was a gift to everyone around her. But this was too far. "I'm changing the locks on my gate," he said, "and if I catch you here again, I'll call the police." Karen let out a sharp laugh. Oh, please. The police. What are you going to say? Oh, officer, my neighbor took a little swim in my pool. Arrest her. She shook her head and scoffed. Give me a break. Marcus didn't blink. Trespassing is trespassing. She stared at him for a moment, her smile faltering just slightly. Then she shook her head and grabbed her champagne bottle. Whatever. You don't have to be such an ass about it. He stepped aside as she walked past him, barefoot and dripping, leaving a trail of water on his deck. As she opened the gate, she turned back and flashed a smirk. You really should learn to share, Marcus. Then she slipped out, closing the gate behind her like nothing had happened. Marcus stood there for a long moment, watching the water ripple in the now empty pool. His fists slowly unclenched, but his anger remained. She thought this was over. She thought she could laugh it off like she always did. She had no idea who she was messing with. As Marcus walked back into his house, his mind was already at work. If she wanted to treat his property like a community pool, he was about to make sure she regretted it. A slow smirk formed on his face as an idea took shape. Karen had picked the wrong person to mess with. Marcus spent the rest of the day simmering in frustration, replaying the morning's events in his head. Karen had strutted out of his backyard like she had every right to be there, completely dismissing the fact that she was in the wrong. And worse, she had laughed at his warning, acting as if he was overreacting. That only fueled his resolve. This wasn't over. If she thought she could get away with this, she was about to learn a hard lesson. By that evening, he had a plan. The first thing he did was install new locks on his backyard gate. The old one had been flimsy, easy to slip open, but this was a heavy-duty padlock. There was no way she was getting in without climbing, and Marcus had a feeling Karen wasn't the type to put in that much effort. Next, he ordered security cameras online. If she ever tried to pull this stunt again, he wanted evidence, clear, undeniable footage that would shut down any excuses she might come up with. She could laugh all she wanted, but she wouldn't be laughing when the police had video proof of her trespassing. But Marcus wasn't stopping there. No, he wanted to make sure Karen felt his response. So the next morning, he got to work on his ultimate deterrent. It was early, just past sunrise, when he rolled up his sleeves and grabbed the extra-strength pool shock he had stored in his shed. He poured a generous amount into the water, watching as it mixed and fizzled beneath the surface. This wasn't the usual maintenance dose. This was enough to irritate the skin if someone swam in it too soon. It wouldn't cause any real harm, but it would definitely make Karen uncomfortable if she decided to ignore his warning. For added effect, he pulled out his Bluetooth speaker and placed it on the deck. He had a special playlist queued up, one he knew would annoy the hell out of her if she overheard it. Karen loved her peaceful, spa-like mornings. Well, today she was getting loud, bass-heavy rap music, shaking the fence. Satisfied with his setup, Marcus went inside, grabbed a cup of coffee, and waited. And sure enough, not even 2 hours later, he heard it. The telltale clink of his backyard gate rattling. He didn't even have to look outside to know who it was. A few seconds later, an annoyed voice rang out over the fence. "Marcus! What the hell?" He smirked and took a slow sip of his coffee before stepping outside. Karen stood just beyond the locked gate, arms crossed, looking completely flustered. Behind her, she held a rolled-up pool float, clearly intending to sneak back in. Marcus leaned against the doorframe, his expression calm but smug. "Problem?" Karen huffed. "Why is the gate locked?" "Because it's my pool," he said simply, "and you don't have permission to use it." Her eyes narrowed. "Seriously? Are you really being this petty?" Marcus chuckled. "Oh, I'm just getting started." Karen's face twisted in frustration as she rattled the gate again, as if she could somehow force it open through sheer annoyance. When that didn't work, she huffed and placed her hands on her hips, glaring at Marcus like he was the one being unreasonable. "This is ridiculous," she said. "It's a pool, Marcus. It's water. You don't own water." Marcus took another slow sip of his coffee, letting the silence stretch between them before replying. "You're right. I don't own water, but I do own this pool, this yard, and this property. And you, Karen, don't belong on any of it." She scoffed and crossed her arms. "You're really locking me out? After all this time?" Marcus raised an eyebrow. "After all this time? You were never supposed to be in here to begin with." Karen let out an exasperated laugh, shaking her head. Wow, just wow. You're acting like I broke into your house or something. It's just a neighborhood pool. Marcus tilted his head. No, it's my pool. You just decided to start treating it like a community amenity. Karen pursed her lips, her irritation growing by the second. She glanced past Marcus, eyeing the clear blue water, then her gaze flicked to the Bluetooth speaker. A scowl crossed her face as she realized what was playing. Heavy bass, loud beats, and exactly the kind of music she always complained about. Really, Marcus? She snapped, motioning toward the speaker. You think blasting this garbage makes you clever? Marcus smirked. I think it makes me entertained. Karen let out a dramatic sigh and threw up her hands. Fine, you win. You're the king of the pool. Congratulations. She turned as if to leave, but then spun back around. But you know what? This is exactly why people in the neighborhood don't like you. You don't know how to be a good neighbor. Marcus let out a short, amused laugh. A good neighbor? He took a step toward the fence. Karen, a good neighbor doesn't trespass. A good neighbor doesn't ignore property lines. And a good neighbor, sure as hell, doesn't act entitled to things that aren't theirs. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but Marcus held up a hand, cutting her off. But since you care so much about what the neighborhood thinks, he pulled out his phone and turned the screen toward her. Her eyes widened as she saw the live security feed, capturing every second of her standing there, rattling the gate, looking furious over the fact that she couldn't break into his yard. Go ahead, Karen, Marcus said smoothly. Tell me more about what a good neighbor should do, because I'd be happy to show this footage to our HOA. Karen's face went pale. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, she had nothing to say. She clenched her jaw, turned on her heel, and stormed off without another word. Marcus chuckled, watching her retreat. Checkmate. Marcus stood by the gate, watching Karen stomp away like a child who had just been told no for the first time in her life. She didn't turn around. She didn't try to argue further. She just disappeared into her house, slamming her door behind her. He let out a slow breath and finally allowed himself to relax. That should be the end of it. Or so he thought. The next morning, Marcus woke up feeling victorious. He stretched, enjoying the peace of knowing that his pool was finally his again. No uninvited guests, no entitled nonsense, just him in the backyard he worked hard for. He made himself a cup of coffee, stepped outside onto his deck, and took in the quiet. But something felt off. His eyes scanned the yard, and then they landed on it, the pool. Floating in the water, smack in the center, was a giant inflatable flamingo. Marcus narrowed his eyes. No way. He walked closer, scanning the area. The gate was still locked, no signs of forced entry. The security cameras hadn't alerted him to anything unusual overnight. And yet, there it was. A blatant, smug little message from Karen. Marcus sighed and shook his head. She really thought this was a game. Fine. He pulled out his phone, opened the security app, and started scrolling through the footage. It didn't take long to find the answer. At 2:43 a.m., the camera near the side of his fence caught movement. And there she was, Karen, standing in her backyard with a flamingo float in her hands. Instead of trying to break in, she had hurled the damn thing over the fence like a petty teenager. Marcus exhaled a short laugh. This woman was unbelievable. He glanced at the ridiculous float bobbing in the water. He could have just fished it out, tossed it in the trash, and called it a day. But no, if Karen wanted to be childish, he could match her energy. So, instead of getting rid of it, Marcus went back inside, grabbed a permanent marker, and walked right back to the pool. He pulled the flamingo onto the deck and, with careful precision, wrote in big, bold letters across its bright pink surface, "Trespassers will be prosecuted." Then, grinning to himself, he walked to her front yard and dropped the flamingo right on her doorstep. As he turned to leave, he glanced up at her security camera. He gave it a little wave before heading back home, fully satisfied. The next few days were blissfully peaceful. No sounds of splashing from his pool, no unexpected guests, no passive-aggressive comments. It seemed like Karen had finally gotten the message. And then, one evening, Marcus got an anonymous letter in his mailbox. No return address, no name. Just one printed sentence on a sheet of paper. "This isn't over." Marcus smirked. Oh, he hoped it wasn't.